trapped, gagged, and facing a killer's knife in a desolate skyscraper, Alara's world crumbled. She thought the cold, calculating billionaire who claimed her historic library had abandoned her. But the city's most ruthless mafia boss unleashed primal fury, tearing through that tower to reclaim his archivist. Now she's bound to his dark empire, a prisoner of his dangerous obsession. Can her soul truly be free? The damp chill that perpetually clung to the Viridian archive was more than just a matter of thermodynamics. It was a creeping despair, a physical manifestation of decay that settled deep into Alara Vance's bones. At 26, she carried the weight of generations on her slender shoulders, a burden far too heavy for a woman who barely earned enough to cover the cracked plaster ceiling of her tiny apartment upstairs. Each morning, the first metallic clang of the antiquated heating system, a sound more akin to a dying beast groaning, was her alarm. It signaled not the dawn of a new day, but the reawakening of an endless battle against time, rust, and the insidious indifference of a world too busy building glittering skyscrapers to care for dusty, forgotten truths. Her fingers, perpetually stained with ink and the faint, sweet scent of aging paper, traced the intricate patterns on a leather-bound folio. A History of Lost Civilizations, the title declared in faded gold leaf. Irony, sharp and bitter, twisted in her gut. She, Alara, the junior archivist, was fighting a losing war for a civilization rapidly becoming lost to itself. Dust motes, like tiny, defiant spirits, danced in the anemic shafts of morning light that pierced the grime-coated stained glass windows. They illuminated not grandeur, but the heartbreaking reality, sagging bookshelves, water-stained ceilings, and the ever-present, cloying smell of mildew battling the faint, comforting aroma of old parchment. Morning, Alara, a voice thin as spun sugar, drifted from the cavernous main reading room. Mr. Henderson. His voice used to boom, resonating with the wisdom of the countless volumes he guarded. Now it was a whisper, a tremor. He shuffled past, a ghost amongst the ghosts of knowledge, his tweed jacket hanging loose on his shrinking frame. His once sharp eyes, usually alight with a historian's passion, were cloudy, his steps hesitant. Alara's heart clenched, a familiar ache. Mr. Henderson was the archive, and like the archive, he was slowly, painfully fading. She longed to wrap him in a blanket of warmth and silence, to shield him from the relentless onslaught of reality, but she couldn't even manage that for herself. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," she replied, her voice attempting a cheerfulness she didn't feel. "Did you manage to find your tea?" "Ah, yes. The Earl Grey." A touch of civilization in these trying times. He offered a weak smile. Then his gaze drifted to a stack of envelopes impaled on the spike of her desk. Not bills for utilities, those were long past due. These were different, thicker, emblazoned with the formidable logo of Thorn Development Group. Legal notices, eviction threats. They were growing bolder, more frequent, their language more menacing. A tremor ran through Alara. She imagined the sleek, predatory smile of Silas Thorne, the man who saw the Viridian archive not as a repository of human thought, but as a prime piece of urban real estate, ripe for demolition. He wanted her kingdom, and he was coming for it, piece by agonizing piece. She remembered the last meeting, weeks ago, a sterile office reeking of new money and false promises. Thorne, impeccably dressed, his eyes like chips of glacial ice, had offered her a generous severance package. A pittance, really, an insult veiled as charity, for abandoning her life's work. "This building is a relic, Miss Vance," he purred, his voice smooth as polished stone. "An inefficient use of valuable space. Progress waits for no one. Progress." The word tasted like ash in her mouth. For Alara, the archive wasn't just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, a sanctuary. Each book, each letter, each fragile map held a story, a human connection across centuries. To lose it would be to lose a part of herself, a part of humanity. It was an unspoken oath she'd made the day she first walked through its immense doors as a wide-eyed intern, breathing in the scent of wisdom and dreaming of a future steeped in the past. Now that dream was suffocating. She slid her hand across the cold, worn oak of her desk, feeling the faint indentations left by countless hands. A silent testament to perseverance. Could she find the same strength? Every avenue she'd explored, grants, petitions, crowdfunding, had met with a dead end. The archive was too old, too expensive, too niche. A luxury the city no longer believed it could afford. She was a lone warrior, wielding a butter knife against an army of bulldozers. The thought was a raw wound, festering in her heart. Sometimes, in the quiet hours after Mr. Henderson had retired to his small apartment on the third floor, the archive truly felt like a tomb. The vast, empty shelves seemed to exhale the forgotten sighs of scholars, the whispered hopes of poets. Alara would walk the silent aisles, her footsteps echoing unnervingly loud, a single flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. She'd run her fingers along the spines of books, a silent prayer for their survival. It was during these solitary vigils that the quiet defiance would resurface, a stubborn ember in the ashes of her despair. She wouldn't let it die. Not yet. Not while there was breath in her body, or a single page left to turn. Tonight, the quiet was heavier than usual. A storm was brewing outside, the wind whistling mournfully through broken panes, rattling the loose timbers of the roof. Rain began to patter against the skylight, each drop a tiny accusation. Alara stared at a faded photograph on her desk, her younger self, beaming, holding a dusty tome, standing next to a robust, smiling Mr. Henderson. Hope, bright and untainted, shone in her eyes. Where had that girl gone? A sharp thwack startled her. She flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was just a branch, she told herself, swaying against the window in the wind. But the anxiety lingered, a cold dread twisting her stomach. Thorne's lawyers had sent a final notice that morning, demanding all remaining assets be liquidated. The ultimatum was clear: sell the most valuable manuscripts, or the entire building with all its contents would be seized and demolished within the week. The thought of those precious, irreplaceable books, the medieval texts, the Renaissance folios, the ancient maps, being pawed over, scattered, or worse, destroyed by Thorne's wrecking balls, sent a spike of pure, unadulterated terror through her. It felt like a physical blow. She couldn't allow it. Even if it meant sacrificing a part of the archive to save the whole, she had to try. Her gaze fell on the polished oak of the main entrance doors, now marred by a fresh, vivid splash of red paint, a crude, violent X scrawled across the centuries-old wood. A message, not just from Thorne, but from someone darker, more aggressive, sending a visceral shiver down her spine. The despair that had been a dull ache now sharpened into a raw, bleeding wound. She pressed her palms against her eyes, willing the image away, but it burned behind her lids. She was alone. Utterly, irrevocably alone. The weight of the archive, of Mr. Henderson's fading life, of the sheer, devastating injustice of it all, pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. The red X wasn't just a threat to the building. It felt like a mark on her own chest, a target. And as the wind howled outside, carrying the mournful cries of the city, Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the fight she was about to face was far more dangerous than just legal battles. She would have to descend into the very heart of the beast, and she had no idea what monstrous things awaited her there. The auction, now, was her last, desperate stand. The auction room, usually reserved for hushed academic symposia or genteel charity galas, thrummed with a grotesque energy. It was a bizarre, almost sacrilegious spectacle, a death knell disguised as a cultural event. Fluorescent lights, unforgiving and harsh, glared down on the velvet-draped podium, mercilessly highlighting the dust motes still dancing in the air and the frantic, almost desperate sheen on Alara Vance's brow. She stood beside the auctioneer, a forced, professional smile plastered on her lips, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Each thump was a countdown to the irreversible dismemberment of the Viridian archive. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, expensive cologne, and the cloying, aggressive perfume of desperation. Alara could feel the predatory gazes of the collectors, sharp and calculating, dissecting each manuscript not for its inherent wisdom, but for its market value. And then there were Thorne's people, identifiable by their crisp suits and shark-like grins, scattered throughout the small crowd like insidious parasites, ready to push down prices to dismantle. Next, Lot 17, the auctioneer droned, his voice devoid of warmth, a rare 15th century illuminated psalter, exceptional condition. He held up the leather-bound volume, its gilt edges catching the unforgiving light. Alara's breath hitched. This was it. One of the crown jewels, a piece of art and history she had personally conserved, its delicate miniatures whispering tales of forgotten monks. To sell it felt like tearing a limb from a living body. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alara interjected, her voice trembling slightly, but infused with a raw passion that cut through the sterile atmosphere. Her gaze swept across the room, pleading. This isn't merely an item for acquisition. This psalter, like all the works in the Viridian archive, represents a beacon of human endeavor, a testament to Miss Vance, a A sneering voice from the third row cut her off. It was Mr. Davies, one of Thorne's principal liquidators, his smile a reptilian flash of teeth. We are all aware of the archive's lofty ideals, but today we deal in commerce, not sentiment. Let's proceed, shall we? A ripple of uncomfortable chuckles spread through the room. Alara felt a blush creep up her neck, a hot wave of humiliation. Her impassioned plea had fallen flat, crushed under the heel of cold, brutal pragmatism. Her hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms. Futile, Thorne's voice echoed in her memory. The bidding began, a rapid-fire exchange of numbers, cold and impersonal. Alara watched, numb, as the price soared, a testament to the Salter's undeniable value, yet a horrifying confirmation of its impending departure. She felt a profound sense of failure, a crushing weight of defeat. She hadn't been strong enough. She hadn't been persuasive enough. She hadn't saved it. Just as the hammer was about to fall, a strange hush descended. A shift in the air, subtle yet undeniable, prickled Alara's skin. The murmur of voices died down, heads subtly turned. A man entered the room, moving with an effortless grace that belied his imposing stature. Dante Valerius. The name, whispered in hushed tones even in the most secure circles, had reached Alara's ears through fragmented news reports and hushed rumors from Mr. Henderson's more politically savvy contacts. He wasn't just wealthy, he was powerful. Dangerously so. He was a masterpiece of controlled intensity. His tailored dark suit, likely Italian silk, draped over a physique that spoke of lethal capability beneath its refined exterior. His black hair was slicked back, revealing a sharp, aquiline nose and a jawline carved from granite. His eyes, the color of storm clouds gathering over a dark sea, swept across the room with a gaze that seemed to miss nothing, yet revealed everything. There was no warmth, no discernible emotion, only an unnerving, absolute command. He exuded an aura of calculated menace, of a quiet predator observing its domain. The room, usually so boisterous, seemed to shrink under his singular presence. Even Thorne's men seemed to hold their breath, their usual arrogance momentarily deflated. Dante didn't take a seat. He simply stood at the back, leaning casually against a gilded column, his dark eyes finally settling on Alara. A shiver, not entirely unpleasant, traced its way down her spine. It was a sensation of being utterly seen, stripped bare by a gaze that understood more than she herself did. It was unsettling, terrifying, yet strangely compelling. Going once, going twice. The auctioneer stammered, clearly unnerved by Dante's silent arrival. Wait. Dante's voice was a low rumble, rich and dangerous, cutting through the thick air. It wasn't loud, but it commanded absolute attention. Every head swiveled. Alara's breath caught in her throat. He was going to bid on the Salter, she thought, a faint, desperate spark of hope flickering. Maybe he would truly appreciate it. Lot 23, please, Dante stated, his eyes still locked on Alara, a faint, almost imperceptible tilt of his head. The small, water-damaged journal. The auctioneer blinked, flustered. Lot 23? Sir, that's a minor piece, quite insignificant compared to the Salter. It was salvaged from. I'm aware, Dante cut in, his tone edged with an impatience that brooked no argument. The journal. My bid is 200,000. A collective gasp swept through the room. 200,000 for a water-damaged, forgotten journal? It was unheard of. The Salter, priceless as it was, hadn't even reached that figure yet. Thorne's liquidators exchanged bewildered glances. Davies looked ready to choke on his own indignation. Alara stared, her mind reeling. The journal was indeed a minor piece, one she had meticulously salvaged from a leaky roof section, a personal project, a forgotten diary of a 19th-century botanist. It held sentimental value to her, but certainly not market value. 200,000 going once, twice. Sold. To Mr. Valerius. The hammer fell with a resounding thwack, sealing the bizarre transaction. Dante pushed himself off the column, moving with unhurried purpose. He bypassed the Salter, ignored the stunned faces, and walked directly towards the podium. His eyes never left Alara's. She felt a magnetic pull, a strange gravity that rooted her to the spot, even as every instinct screamed at her to flee. He reached the podium, his long fingers retrieving the small, unassuming journal from a display table. He examined it briefly, then tucked it under his arm as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. His gaze returned to Alara, piercing, possessive. He leaned in, his scent, expensive leather, clean linen, and something subtly dangerous, like old whiskey and gun smoke, enveloping her. Her skin tingled. "Defiance is an interesting quality, Miss Vance," he murmured, his voice a silken rasp, barely audible above the stunned silence of the room. A shiver, colder than the archive's damp chill, ran down her spine, especially when it's utterly futile. He didn't wait for her reply. He simply turned, a dark, imposing silhouette, and walked out, his retinue silently falling into step behind him. The heavy oak doors swung shut with a soft thud, leaving Alara standing alone on the podium, the echoes of his words reverberating in the suddenly too quiet room. "Defiance is an interesting quality, especially when it's utterly futile." He had seen her. He had understood her struggle, her passion, her desperation. And he had, in one cryptic remark and one baffling purchase, marked her. A nascent fear, cold and sharp, began to bloom in her chest, intertwined with a grudging, unsettling admiration for his sheer, unbridled power. What did he want? Why the journal? And what did his unsettling words truly mean for her, and for the crumbling kingdom she so desperately sought to save? The auction, meant to save the archive, had merely ushered in a new, terrifying, and utterly unpredictable threat. The red X, painted across the Viridian Archive's main oak doors, glowed with malevolent intent under the anemic light of a drizzling Tuesday morning. It wasn't just paint. It was a wound, a festering insult to history itself. Alara ran a trembling hand over the crude mark, feeling the rough texture beneath her fingertips, a stark contrast to the smooth, centuries-old wood. The wind, sharp and biting, whipped around her, tugging at the thin fabric of her coat, mimicking the icy dread that had taken root in her stomach. She had spent the night in a restless stupor, Dante Valerius's words echoing in the cavernous silence of her tiny apartment. "Defiance is an interesting quality, Miss Vance, especially when it's utterly futile." Futile. The word was a poison, seeping into every crack of her resolve. He hadn't bought the Psalter, the archive's most precious jewel. He bought a water-damaged journal, a personal project of hers, for an obscene amount, and then delivered a veiled threat. What kind of man did that? What kind of game was he playing? Her thoughts were abruptly shattered by the arrival of a thick, official-looking envelope slid under the main door. It landed with a soft thud on the cold marble, a final, definitive sound. Alara bent, her fingers fumbling with the heavy paper. Inside, 3 separate notices. The first, a formal freeze on the Viridian Archive's dwindling bank accounts, citing unresolved legal liabilities. The second, an accelerated demolition order, effective in 3 days, for the entire property. 3 days. The air in her lungs seemed to constrict, suddenly thin and inadequate. The third, a personal eviction notice for her apartment above the archive, giving her 48 hours to vacate. My home. A wave of nausea washed over her. It was a targeted attack, brutal and relentless. Thorne wasn't just after the land anymore. He was systematically dismantling her life, atom by atom. The injustice of it all was a hot, burning ember in her chest, but beneath it, a cold, creeping panic began to spread. This wasn't just about the archive. It was about her. Alara. Mr. Henderson's voice, frail and distant, called from the inner sanctum. "Is everything all right out there? I thought I heard." "Everything's fine, Mr. Henderson." Alara forced a bright, false note into her voice, crumpling the notices in her hand. She couldn't let him see this. Not now. His already fragile heart couldn't take any more blows. She tucked the papers into her pocket, the edges digging into her thigh, constant, painful reminder. Later that afternoon, the first subtle acts of sabotage began. A faint, acrid smell led her to the rarely used map room. A small smoldering pile of old newspapers, carelessly placed beneath a shelf of ancient nautical charts, had been discovered by a cleaner, extinguished just in time. The stench of smoke hung heavy, clinging to the priceless paper. Alara's stomach churned. It wasn't an accident. The fire extinguisher had been tampered with. It could have been disastrous, she whispered to Mr. Henderson, trying to keep her voice steady, but the tremor was undeniable. Someone tried to burn the maps. Mr. Henderson, perched precariously on a wobbly stool, ran a liver-spotted hand over his wrinkled face. His eyes, usually filled with a gentle wisdom, were wide with a fear Alara had never seen before. This is This is beyond Thorne, Alara. This is criminal. Malicious. He coughed, a dry, rattling sound that tore at Alara's heart. We must call the police. Immediately, she had called everyone. The police took a report, their tone polite but dismissive. No clear evidence of arson, Miss Vance. Could have been faulty wiring, a vagrant looking for warmth. Of a vagrant? In a locked, alarm-set room? The absurdity of it was infuriating. Her frantic calls to various pro bono legal aid services were met with similar dead ends. Thorne Development. Oh, they have very thorough lawyers, Miss Vance. Difficult case. Perhaps you should consider their offer. Each polite refusal felt like a fresh cut, bleeding away her last vestiges of hope. The system, the very framework meant to protect, was rigged against her, a vast, invisible web spawned by Thorne's money and influence. She was screaming into a void. The following morning, the inevitable happened. Alara found Mr. Henderson slumped over his desk in his small office, surrounded by stacks of old financial ledgers, his face ashen, a faint sheen of sweat on his brow. The half-empty teacup lay shattered on the floor beside him, its delicate porcelain shards scattered like broken dreams. Mr. Henderson. She rushed to him, her heart leaping into her throat. His breathing was shallow, ragged, his hand clutched at his chest. Mr. Henderson, can you hear me? The numbers, Alara, he rasped, his eyes fluttering open, clouded with pain and a desperate, frantic terror. They froze everything. We're finished. He slipped into unconsciousness, his head lolling against her shoulder, his weight heavy and terrifyingly lifeless. Panic, cold and visceral, seized Alara. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers clumsy, slick with sweat. 911, the shrill urgency of her voice, the frantic details she relayed, the blaring siren that shattered the archive's sacred silence. It was all a blur. As the paramedics wheeled Mr. Henderson out on a stretcher, his face a pale mask of suffering, Alara felt a profound, crushing wave of guilt. This is my fault. Her fight, her stubbornness, had pushed him to this. The burden of responsibility, once a manageable weight, now felt like a crushing boulder on her chest. She was failing him. She was failing the archive. She was failing everyone. She returned to her apartment above the archive, the silence deafening, punctuated only by the mournful creak of old pipes. The air felt heavy, oppressive, thick with the scent of fear and despair. She sank onto her worn sofa, burying her face in her hands, tears finally, miserably, blurring her vision. What now? There was no one left to turn to. No options. Only surrender. A soft, almost imperceptible hum startled her. It wasn't the old pipes. It was coming from the wall behind her bookshelf. She peered behind a stack of dusty novels. A small, sleek black box, affixed neatly to the plaster, a tiny red light pulsing rhythmically. A security camera. Or something more. Its presence was unnerving, an invisible eye watching her in her sanctuary. She hadn't installed it. No one else had access. Darn it. Her phone buzzed, startling her again. An anonymous text message. Rent. But utilities. Covered. Archived. Secured. No sender ID, no contact number, just the stark, unequivocal message. Then an email notification popped up. From her bank. A large, untraceable deposit had been made, far more than enough to cover her rent and the archive's most pressing bills. It wasn't charity. It was a demonstration of power. A marker. A claim. Alara stared at the screen, a tempest raging inside her. Relief hot and potent, warred with a searing indignation. She hated it. Hated the feeling of being bought, of having her most desperate needs met by a man who operated in the shadows, a man she barely knew, but whose dangerous power was undeniable. It felt less like help and more like a leash tightening around her neck. He was showing her, without a single word, that he could see everything, fix everything, control everything. He had bought her apartment, her security, even in a twisted way, a sliver of the archive's reprieve. She looked at the black box humming in her wall, then at the notification on her phone, then back at the red X, still stark on the oak doors below. Thorne had paralyzed her through conventional means. Dante was offering an unconventional salvation, but at what unspoken cost? Her pride screamed against it. Her independence, hard-won and fiercely guarded, recoiled. But Mr. Henderson was in a hospital bed, The archive was 3 days from demolition, and she was out of options. Utterly, irrevocably out of options. Her fingers hovered over her phone, over the contact list, over the anonymous text. She could delete it. Pretend it never happened. But the hum of the security system, the paid rent, the knowledge that the archive had a fleeting reprieve, it was a siren song, a dark, dangerous promise of safety. She needed help. Different kind of help. The kind that didn't play by rules, the kind that wielded power like a weapon. The kind that Dante Valerius embodied. With a deep, shuddering breath, Alara made a decision she knew would change her life irrevocably. She had to step into his world, into the very heart of the darkness she had spent her life trying to preserve. She had to acknowledge the debt, the claim. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that a debt to a man like Dante Valerius was never truly repaid. Not with money, at least. The Viridian archive now hummed with a different kind of silence. Not the mournful hush of decay, but a tense, almost breathless quiet, punctuated by the soft, almost imperceptible thrum of newly installed security systems. Alara could feel them, tiny invisible eyes and ears, woven into the very fabric of the ancient building, a pervasive reminder of Dante Valerius's silent claim. He hadn't just bought the archive, he had permeated it, infused it with his dangerous, protective presence. Her stomach fluttered with a blend of indignation and a nascent, unsettling relief. The red X was gone, scrubbed clean, but the stain of its meaning, the mark of a threat, remained. And now, so did the mark of his ownership. Her first inspection with him was a jarring invasion of her sanctuary. He arrived unannounced, as was his way, a dark silhouette framed by the towering oak doors. His suit, charcoal gray today, seemed to absorb the scant light, making him appear even more formidable. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace, his gaze sweeping over the restored sections, the freshly cleaned floors, the discreetly mended roof. He missed nothing. Alara, guiding him, felt like a nervous stewardess presenting her captain with a ship he already owned. The humidity controls are adequate, Dante stated, his voice a low, resonant baritone that sent a strange shiver down her spine. He ran a gloved finger along a shelf, examining not the dust, but the newly installed, almost invisible sensor beneath it. But the airflow could be optimized for the lower stacks. There's a faint scent of residual mold. Alara blinked. She hadn't even registered it, so accustomed was she to the archive's unique perfume. I can arrange for a more thorough assessment, she offered, trying to regain a semblance of control, her professional facade almost cracking under the weight of his undeniable expertise. She hated how easily he saw what she had missed, how effortlessly he pointed out efficiencies in a place she had dedicated her life to. It felt like a subtle accusation, a reminder of her inadequacy. No need, he replied, his eyes, dark as obsidian, briefly met hers. It's already in motion. He walked towards a towering shelf of ancient globes, tracing the faded lines of forgotten continents. You have a particular affinity for cartography, Miss Vance. Her breath hitched. How would you know that? It was a detail so minor, so personal. A fleeting interest she'd mentioned to Mr. Henderson months ago. He merely offered a slight, enigmatic tilt of his head. Information is an archive, isn't it? One merely needs to know how to read it. His answer was both dismissive and profoundly unsettling, hinting at a network of surveillance far beyond her comprehension. He wasn't just observing the archive, he was observing her. The thought ignited a flicker of anger, hot and rebellious, but it was quickly doused by a cold awareness of her precarious position. She was indebted. She was watched. The inspections became a regular fixture, unpredictable and silently authoritative. Sometimes he would simply appear, observe for a few minutes, then vanish, leaving behind the ghost of his expensive cologne and the lingering tension of his presence. Other times, he would engage her in conversations that defied her expectations. He didn't just understand the value of the rare books. He seemed to possess an intimate knowledge of their contents. He debated the philosophical underpinnings of Enlightenment texts, quoted obscure Latin passages from medieval codices, and discussed the intricate symbolism of Renaissance art. His intellect was sharp, formidable, and entirely captivating. Alara found herself, much to her own chagrin, looking forward to these encounters. She resisted his control, fiercely defending her methods and her autonomy whenever possible, but she couldn't deny the reluctant fascination blooming within her. He was a dangerous man, a mafia boss whose influence stretched into the shadows, Yet he moved through her world of brittle paper and ancient wisdom with an unexpected, almost tender reverence. It was a dichotomy that both terrified and thrilled her. One late afternoon, as a spring rain lashed against the archival windows, Dante found her meticulously restoring a brittle 17th century botanical drawing. Her hair, usually confined in a neat bun, had escaped its pins, wisps framing her flushed face. He watched her for a long moment, silent, before a gloved hand placed a steaming cup of Earl Grey on her desk, exactly how she liked it, with a hint of lemon and no sugar. "For your meticulous work," he stated, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. It wasn't a question, nor a command. It was a simple offering. Alara looked up, startled. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into her cold fingers, a small, unexpected comfort. "Thank you," she managed, her voice a little unsteady. The quiet care, so at odds with his formidable persona, was disarming. It chipped away at her carefully constructed defenses. She watched him walk away, her gaze lingering on the broad expanse of his back, the impeccable cut of his suit. There was a dangerous magnetism to him, a pull she was finding increasingly difficult to ignore. A week later, a package arrived. Unmarked, delivered by a silent, watchful man in a black suit. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a first edition of The Lost Garden of Eden, a legendary botanical guide Alara had only ever dreamed of seeing, let alone holding. Its pages were exquisitely preserved, its illustrations vibrant. It was the companion volume to the very journal Dante had purchased at the auction, and a text she had been searching for in vain for years. It belonged to a private collector, Dante said when she confronted him, finding him observing a newly installed air purification system in the main hall. He had no further use for it. His tone was flat, devoid of emotion, yet the gesture spoke volumes. He remembered. He listened. He provided. It was a quiet, insidious form of seduction, a demonstration of his power to fulfill her deepest, most scholarly desires. "You shouldn't," she began, her voice tight with a mixture of gratitude and stubborn pride. "It is a necessary acquisition for the Viridian archive," he interrupted smoothly, his gaze intense, pinning her in place. "And therefore, it is yours to protect. As is this entire establishment." His words were a reminder of his dominion, yet there was a possessive tenderness in his eyes that made her breath catch. The air between them thickened, charged with an undeniable, unsettling chemistry. It was a dangerous dance, this push and pull, a delicate balance between defiance and surrender. She found herself, against all reason, drawn to the quiet depths of his intellect, the unexpected flashes of his humanity beneath the cold, formidable exterior. Her mind, usually so clear and focused on historical preservation, now became a turbulent sea of conflicting emotions, apprehension, reluctant fascination, and a forbidden desire that pulsed beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. She knew he was dangerous, that to fall under his sway would mean losing a part of herself, but the thought of his protective strength, the way his presence made her feel utterly, terrifyingly secure, was a powerful, intoxicating lure. One evening, as dusk bled through the newly cleaned skylight, painting the archive in hues of bruised violet and deepening shadow, Alara found herself alone, standing before the restored medieval psalter. She ran her fingers over the intricate illumination, a scene depicting a knight saving a maiden from a dragon. A faint smile touched her lips. She wasn't a maiden, and he was no shining knight, but he had saved her archive, and in doing so, he had woven himself into the very fabric of her existence. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Suddenly, a faint ping echoed from the security system's central console. A new alert. Alara's heart seized. It was a remote access attempt, detected and blocked, but the source was chillingly familiar. Silas Thorne. He hadn't vanished after Dante's initial warning. He was still out there, lurking, testing the defenses, a predator waiting for an opening. The archive, once again, felt vulnerable. And for the first time, Alara didn't just feel fear for the building. She felt a cold dread for what Thorne might attempt next, and a burning, desperate need for the dangerous, possessive protection of the man who had claimed her and her crumbling kingdom as his own. She knew with chilling certainty that the quiet truce was about to shatter. The first attack came not with a bulldozer, but with a whisper, then a shout, then a headline. Alara discovered it tucked between the folds of a newspaper left on her reading table, a splash of garish yellow next to the dignified black and white of the main news. Archive heiress or gold digger? Questions swirl around young archivist and mysterious benefactor. Her name, Ilara Vance, stark and unsettling, glared back at her from the cheaply printed page. The article, thinly veiled gossip from an obscure local rag, painted her as a manipulative opportunist, exploiting an ailing old man and charming a shadowy, powerful figure to seize control of the archive's valuable land. It subtly implied a dubious relationship with Dante, hinting at illicit dealings and an ambition that bordered on the grotesque. A cold, sickening dread crawled into Ilara's throat. It was Thorn. She could feel his oily fingerprints all over it. He hadn't dared to attack Dante directly, but he knew how to strike at the periphery, to undermine the moral ground, to weaponize perception. This wasn't just an attack on her character. It was an attempt to delegitimize the archive's salvation, to twist Dante's intervention into something sordid and corrupt. The phone calls started soon after, veiled accusations from old grant committees, thinly disguised curiosity from former colleagues, the sharp edge of judgment in the voices of people she once respected. Each call was a fresh sting, a public fling. Her hands trembled as she clutched the newspaper, its cheap ink smudging her fingertips. Humiliation, hot and potent, washed over her, mingled with a burning rage. How dare he? How dare he defile her name, her work, her dedication? She wanted to scream, to tear the paper to shreds, to march directly to Thorn's gleaming corporate tower and confront him. But what good would it do? He lived in a world of lawyers and loopholes, a world where truth was malleable and reputation was a weapon. This is unconscionable, Mr. Henderson declared, his voice weak but firm, his eyes flashing with a spark of his old fire as he finished reading the article from his hospital bed. Ilara visited him religiously, bringing him rare books and news of the archive's slow, hesitant recovery. He was frail, but recovering. We must issue a formal retraction. Contact a libel lawyer. Ilara nodded, though a hollow certainty had settled in her heart. She knew it would be futile. She'd already tried. Lawyers, cautious of Thorn's formidable legal team, had demurred. Public relations firms quoted exorbitant fees she couldn't afford. The conventional world had no answer for the insidious poison Thorn was spreading. She felt exposed, vulnerable, stripped naked in the public eye. Dante predictably heard about it. He didn't call. He simply appeared at the archive late one evening when the last volunteer had left and the silence was once again thick with her anxiety. He stood in the main reading room amidst the towering shelves, his dark suit a stark contrast to the subdued lighting. He held a copy of the offending newspaper, folded precisely, the headline facing her. His expression was unreadable, his eyes, dark and fathomless, fixed on her. "This displeases me," he stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed subtly off the high ceilings. It wasn't a question or a statement of sympathy. It was a pronouncement. Ilara felt a fresh wave of indignation. "It displeases me too, Mr. Valerius. My name, my work, my entire life is being slandered, and I have no way to fight back." The words burst from her, raw and unfiltered, fueled by days of simmering frustration. He merely regarded her, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in his dark eyes. "You tried the conventional methods, I presume?" "Of course I did," she retorted defensively. "But Thorn's influence runs too deep. No one wants to touch it." "Indeed," he murmured, his gaze still holding hers, intense and unnerving. "He makes a mistake. He assumes my ownership of this archive, and by extension, my interest in its director, is a weakness. He believes he can erode it with whispers." A chilling smile, devoid of humor, touched his lips. "He will learn otherwise." The next few days were a blur of anxious waiting for Ilara. She saw no direct intervention from Dante, no public statements, no legal battles. She watched the news, searched online, but the smear campaign continued to fester, a persistent, annoying fly buzzing around her and the archive. She felt a flicker of doubt. Was Dante truly as powerful as she believed? Or was his reach limited to the shadows, unable to combat the harsh light of public scrutiny? Then the storm broke. Not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, devastating detonations that rippled through the city's elite. First, a sudden, unexpected audit of Thorn Development Group's finances, launched by an obscure but highly influential regulatory body, citing irregularities in land acquisition and development permits. The news hit the financial wires like a lead weight, causing Thorn's stock to plummet. Next, a series of damning exposés began to appear in highly respected national newspapers, not about Ilara, but about Silas Thorn himself. They detailed long-buried controversies, unethical business practices, forced evictions of low-income tenants, shady political donations, and a surprisingly vulnerable legal battle over a protected historical site he had illegally demolished years ago, a scandal hushed up by powerful connections. The articles were meticulously researched, the evidence irrefutable, and the timing impeccable, coinciding with the financial tremors. Alara watched stunned as Thorne's carefully crafted public image, once unassailable, began to crumble. His philanthropic endeavors were exposed as mere tax shelters, his aggressive development projects recast as ruthless land grabs. The city, usually so quick to forgive wealth, now turned its gaze on him with collective righteous fury. The backlash was swift and brutal. Investors pulled out. Permits were frozen. His public appearances became a gauntlet of angry protesters and relentless journalists, demanding answers. It was a masterclass in controlled destruction. There was no visible hand, no overt declaration from Dante. Yet Alara knew, with a terrifying certainty, that this was his doing. He hadn't responded with violence, but with surgical precision that cut straight to Thorne's jugular, his reputation, his financial empire, his carefully constructed power base. It was a chilling demonstration of his hidden influence, a cold, calculated dismantling that left no visible fingerprints, only devastating consequences. Alara felt a profound sense of awe mixed with a deep, unsettling apprehension. He hadn't just protected her. He had annihilated her enemy, not with fists, but with whispers and strategically deployed truths. A reluctant sense of security settled over her, heavy and unyielding. She was safe, yes, protected by an unseen, terrifying force. But the power dynamics had shifted irrevocably. She was now undeniably, inextricably linked to a man who wielded shadows and secrets as his weapons, a man who played a game with stakes far higher and rules far darker than she could ever comprehend. That evening, a fresh bouquet of rare orchids appeared on her desk, their petals a vibrant, almost violent shade of crimson. There was no card, no explanation, just the silent, fragrant reminder of Dante's pervasive presence. As Alara stared at them, a new email notification pinged on her archive's official account. It was a scanned image, a faded, grainy photograph of Mr. Henderson, much younger, standing in front of the archive with Thorne, both smiling, shaking hands. The date was old, predating Thorne's current hostile takeover. But what was truly unsettling was the small handwritten note scrawled on the back of the photo, barely legible, always a debt. Never forgotten. Alara's blood ran cold. Thorne wasn't just a greedy developer. He had a deeper, personal connection to Mr. Henderson, to the archive itself. A connection that was far more sinister than she had ever imagined. And Dante, with all his power, might not even know the full extent of the tangled web he had stepped into. The war was far from over, and its roots were buried much deeper than she had thought. The crimson orchids on Alara's desk glowed with an almost violent beauty, a testament to Dante's chillingly effective intervention. Silas Thorne's public dismantling had been swift, precise, and utterly ruthless. His empire, once thought impregnable, was now a hollow shell, his name synonymous with scandal and disgrace. A quiet, profound relief had settled over the archive, a reprieve Alara had barely dared to dream of. Yet it came with a heavy, unsettling cost. She was safe, yes, but the leash, however silken, had tightened. She was now unequivocally under Dante Valerius's formidable protection, an agreement forged not with words, but with power and fear. Her trust in him had deepened, a reluctant, thorny thing. She respected his intelligence, his strategic mind, and the undeniable force of his will. But it was a wary trust, born of necessity and survival, constantly battling her ingrained independence. How could she reconcile the man who quoted ancient philosophers with a man who could, with a mere flick of his wrist, shatter a reputation? The dichotomy was both fascinating and terrifying. It was the photograph that truly unsettled her, turning her tentative relief into a fresh surge of anxiety. The grainy image, scanned and emailed anonymously to the archive's official account, depicted a much younger Mr. Henderson, smiling broadly, shaking hands with a smooth-faced, youthful Silas Thorne. The setting was unmistakably the Viridian Archive's main entrance, bathed in the soft glow of a forgotten summer afternoon. But it was the handwritten note on the back that sent a cold shiver down her spine. Always a debt. Never forgotten. Alara stared at the image on her screen, her fingers trembling. Thorne and Mr. Henderson. Together. A past connection, long before Thorne became the predatory developer she knew. What kind of debt? And Who was it never forgotten by? The question swirled in her mind, dark and dangerous, casting a new ominous light on Thorne's relentless pursuit of the archive. This wasn't just about real estate. It was personal. Deeply, venomously personal. And if Dante had stepped into this unknowingly, then they were both in far greater peril than she had imagined. She found Dante in the main reading room, as if he sensed her agitation. He stood before a newly restored map of the ancient world, his head tilted, studying the faded cartography. The scent of his familiar, expensive cologne, usually a symbol of his invasive presence, now offered a strange, almost comforting anchor in the maelstrom of her thoughts. "I received this," Alara said, her voice tighter than she intended, holding out her phone with the scanned image. She watched his profile, the sharp angle of his jaw, the subtle clench of muscle as his eyes scanned the screen. He didn't flinch, didn't react overtly, but a flicker, something akin to a tightening in his storm cloud eyes, told her he understood the gravity of the image. He took the phone, his fingers brushing hers, sending an unexpected jolt through her skin. He zoomed in on the note, his brow furrowing almost imperceptibly. "Thorne and Henderson," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "An old acquaintance." "It's more than that," Alara insisted, stepping closer, her desperation overriding her usual caution. "That note, always a debt. Never forgotten. It sounds like a promise. Or a curse. What could Thorne possibly have had over Mr. Henderson? Why would he target the archive so vehemently, beyond just the land?" Dante was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the photograph, lost in some distant thought. The soft glow of the monitor illuminated the sharp contours of his face, revealing a subtle tension around his mouth. "Debts have long memories, Alara," he finally said, his voice flat, devoid of his usual controlled power. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the impenetrable facade. A flicker of something akin to a deep-seated weariness, a residual pain. It was a raw, unexpected glimpse into the man beneath the mafia boss. "My family," he began, his voice rougher now, as if the words were pulled from a deep, painful well. "We built an empire. Brick by brick. Promise by promise. My father, he believed in order. In exacting a price for every transgression, every betrayal. He taught me that loyalty was currency, and treachery, a debt paid in blood or ruin." He paused, his gaze drifting to the towering shelves around them, the silent witnesses to centuries of human folly and triumph. He lost something precious, something irreplaceable. Not land, not money, but belief. In a man he called a brother. And that betrayal, it shaped everything that came after. It shaped me. Alara listened, her breath held captive in her chest. The air in the archive felt heavy, charged with the weight of his unspoken history. She imagined a young Dante, hardened by a world that demanded absolute loyalty and delivered brutal betrayals. His possessive nature, his fierce protectiveness, his meticulous control. It wasn't just about power. It was about preventing loss. About guarding against the shattering pain of betrayal he had witnessed, or perhaps experienced himself. He appreciated her dedication to preservation because he understood, intimately, the agony of something precious being lost, something that could never truly be recovered. "So he was betrayed," Alara whispered, the words tasting like ash. "And he built an empire to ensure it would never happen again. To him, or to what he values." Dante nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his head. "To protect what is mine, what is ours." His eyes, dark and intense, found hers again, and this time, the possessiveness was clear, undeniable. But it wasn't threatening. It was an admission. A raw, vulnerable declaration of his claim, born from a lifetime of guarding against loss. Alara felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest, a profound empathy that cut through her wariness. She saw the scars, not physical, but etched deep into his soul, shaping the formidable man before her. He wasn't just a force of nature. He was a product of his past, a man who understood the crushing weight of a legacy, the agony of a debt unpaid, the insidious poison of betrayal. The mafia boss persona, so terrifying before, now seemed like a necessary armor, forged in the fires of a deep personal wound. A fragile, dangerous intimacy settled between them, a silent understanding passing between two souls burdened by their own histories. He had revealed a fragment of his truth, and in doing so had drawn her deeper into his complex, perilous world. The connection, once a reluctant fascination, now felt like an undeniable bond, forged in the crucible of shared vulnerability. But just as that fragile connection solidified, a new, unsettling thought pierced through the quiet. If Thorne's actions were driven by an old, personal debt to Mr. Henderson, what else was hidden beneath the surface? What other ghosts lingered in the archives past, ready to be unearthed? As Alara looked at the photo again, a tiny detail, almost invisible, caught her eye. In the background, partially obscured by a potted plant, was a faded sign on the archive door, closed for renovation, funding from the Thorne Henderson Charitable Trust. Trust. Not just a simple handshake. A formal agreement. A contract. A debt. And as the realization dawned on her, a chilling certainty, cold and sharp, pierced her heart. Thorne's war wasn't just against Dante. It was against the very foundation of the archive itself, a foundation built on a forgotten pact. And if that pact was about to be broken, the true architect of ruin might be far closer and far more sinister than she could ever have imagined. The faded photograph, depicting a younger Mr. Henderson and Silas Thorne shaking hands before a long-forgotten Thorne Henderson Charitable Trust sign, had become a malignant stain on Alara's desk. It mocked her, unraveling the carefully constructed narrative of a ruthless developer and a benevolent savior. The archive wasn't merely a piece of prime real estate to Thorne. It was woven into a deeper, more insidious history. And the note, always a debt, never forgotten, pulsed with a sinister significance, suggesting a legacy of bitterness she couldn't fathom. She tried to talk to Dante about it, but he was gone. Not truly gone, of course. His presence, an invisible, omnipresent hum of surveillance and protection, still lingered in the archive's updated security systems. But he hadn't physically appeared for 3 days, a rare and unsettling absence. He was likely tending to the unseen machinations of his own world, leaving Alara grappling with this new treacherous revelation alone. The very air felt heavy with his phantom presence, a silent judgment on her growing unease. Then the email arrived. It was addressed to her personally from a prestigious historical preservation society, one she had applied to months ago, with little hope of success. Urgent meeting regarding Viridian Archive grant application. High-level funding available. Tomorrow 10 a.m. Secluded office, Thorne Building, North Tower, 27th floor. It seemed too good to be true. A genuine lifeline. The chance to secure funding, to truly make the archive self-sufficient, to finally break free from the invisible chains of Dante's protection. A knot of apprehension twisted in her stomach. It was in the Thorne Building. His lair. Her every instinct screamed caution, remembering Dante's chilling dismantling of Thorne's public image. But the lure of the grant, the promise of true independence, was too powerful to resist. Mr. Henderson was still recovering, frail but lucid, clinging to the hope of the archive's future. She couldn't let this opportunity slip away. Not if there was even a sliver of a chance. She felt a surge of defiance, a fierce, desperate need to prove that she, Alara Vance, could secure the archive's future on her own terms, without Dante's dark interventions. She considered telling him, but hesitated. He would forbid it, of course. His possessive streak, now undeniably a part of their complex dynamic, would see it as a foolish risk. He would send his men, or go himself, turning a potential negotiation into a hostile takeover. This was her chance, her fight. The next morning, the city skyline was a cold, indifferent gray. Alara dressed in her most professional, albeit worn, suit, the fabric feeling thin against her skin. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. With each step towards the imposing steel and glass edifice of the Thorne Building, it seemed to pierce the clouds, a monument to the very greed that threatened to consume her world. The lobby was all gleaming marble and hushed, efficient movements. She felt a profound sense of isolation, a small, fragile entity swallowed by a leviathan. The elevator ride to the 27th floor was agonizingly slow, each upward jerk a tightening of the knot in her gut. The air grew thinner, colder. When the doors finally hissed open, they revealed not a bustling corporate floor, but a desolate, dimly lit corridor. The floor seemed unfinished, wires dangling from exposed conduits, the scent of fresh paint mingling with stale dust. A phantom echo of the archive's own decay. An unsettling sense of dread, cold and sharp, pricked at her skin. This was wrong. Miss Vance. A reedy voice called from the end of the corridor. A young man, too pale, too twitchy, emerged from a shadowed doorway. This way, please. Mr. Thorne will see you now. Mr. Thorne. Not the historical society. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. Trap. A cold wave of terror washed over her, making her legs weak. She wanted to turn, to run, to scream, but her feet felt rooted to the spot, a sudden, suffocating paralysis. She followed him into a vast, unfurnished office. Concrete floors, bare walls, a single table and 2 chairs. And there, standing by a large, uncurtained window that offered a dizzying view of the city below, was Silas Thorne. He turned, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face, his eyes gleaming with a predatory satisfaction. He wasn't the impeccably dressed, smooth-talking businessman she remembered. He looked unhinged, desperate. "Welcome, Miss Vance," Thorne purred, his voice dripping with venom. "Did you truly believe a grant from a historical society would be meeting in my half-finished tower? You're even more naive than I thought." He gestured to the table. "Please sit." Alara stood her ground, her fists clenched at her sides. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "What do you want, Thorne? This has nothing to do with the archive anymore, does it? This is about Mr. Henderson. About some ancient debt." Thorne's smile vanished, replaced by a sneer. "Clever girl. You saw the picture." He walked towards her, his movements jerky, agitated. "That debt, Miss Vance, was my inheritance. My father built this company from nothing alongside Henderson. They were partners. Brothers, they call themselves. But when the market crashed, Henderson, he betrayed my father. Stole his research, his contacts, his legacy, to save his precious archive. Left my father in ruin. And he swore, before he died, that I would collect. From Henderson. And from the archive he protected." The words hung in a stale air, thick with a lifetime of resentment. Alara stared, horrified. The architect of ruin wasn't just Thorne's greed. It was a festering, generations-old wound. Mr. Henderson would never. He did. Thorne roared, his voice cracking with fury. "And now I collect. The archive, your precious books, your old mentor's life. It's all forfeit. And Valerius? The great Dante Valerius, who thinks he owns everything. He will learn that some debts run too deep, too personal, for his money to ever erase." He gestured towards the door, and 2 hulking figures, silent and menacing, stepped out from the shadows. "He isn't here, is he, Miss Vance? Too busy with his own dark games to protect his latest acquisition. He abandoned you, just as Henderson abandoned my father." The accusation struck Alara like a physical blow, a chilling, agonizing twist of the knife. Donna. He was supposed to be her shield, her omnipresent protector. Yet here she was, utterly alone, trapped, facing a desperate, vengeful man and his thugs. Had he known? Had he allowed this? The profound sense of abandonment was a crushing weight, heavier than any physical threat. She had put her faith, her desperate hope, in him, and he was nowhere. One of Thorne's men moved, a blur of gray, and a rough hand clamped over her mouth, muffling her desperate gasp. Her heart leaped into her throat, choking her. Another hand yanked her arms behind her back, binding her wrists with brutal efficiency. The cold, rough rope dug into her skin, a tangible symbol of her helplessness. Her mind raced, a frantic animal trapped in a corner. She tasted blood, either from her lip or the metallic tang of pure, unadulterated fear. "No one is coming for you, Alara," Thorne whispered, his face close to hers, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying, unhinged triumph. "Not Henderson. Not your mafia boss. You are alone, just as my father was. And now you will pay his debt." He pulled a small, wicked-looking knife from his pocket, the blade glinting ominously in the dim light. Alara's breath hitched, a choked sob. The cold steel, the feral gleam in Thorne's eyes. This was it. This was the end. Her mind screamed for Dante, a desperate, silent plea that went unanswered. The archive, Mr. Henderson, her life, all of it would be swallowed by this man's ancient, twisted vengeance. She closed her eyes, bracing herself, the cold knot of despair tightening in her chest, utterly convinced that she was about to face her ruin, abandoned and utterly, hopelessly alone in the desolate, unfinished tower. The silence that followed was suffocating, endless, punctuated only by the pounding of her own terrified heart, waiting for the blade to fall. The faint, almost inaudible ping resonated in Dante Valerius's private office, a sterile space of polished steel and panoramic city views, high above the very skyline Thorne so desperately coveted. It was a digital ghost, a silent alarm from the bespoke security system he had discreetly woven into Alara's apartment, connected to a secure, private network known only to him. It wasn't a blaring siren, but calculated warning, a breach of her apartment's perimeter triggered not by forced entry, but by an unexplained cessation of her personal tracker installed discreetly in the rare botanical journal he had gifted her. The journal was still there in the archive, but Alara Vance, its meticulous guardian, was not. Dante, usually a statue of controlled calm, felt a primal jolt, cold lightning strike of fury that ripped through his carefully constructed composure. His blood, usually cool and calculating, ignited. He had underestimated Thorne. Or rather, he had underestimated the venom of an old, forgotten debt. The scanned photograph of Thorne and Henderson, the chilling note, always a debt. Never forgotten. It all clicked into place with a sickening clarity. Thorne wasn't just attacking his assets. He was attacking his claim. He was touching what was Dante's. Find her. Dante's voice was a low growl into his calm link, devoid of its usual measured cadence, tight with a possessive rage that bordered on the feral. His men, spread across the city, responded, instantly recognizing the rare, dangerous edge in their boss's tone. Every asset, every resource, sweep the city. Every camera, every comm, every shadow. I want Thorne, and I want her. Now, the office, usually a sanctuary of quiet power, erupted into a maelstrom of activity. Keyboards clattered, screens glowed with rapidly updating schematics, and terse, urgent commands flew through the secure lines. Dante watched the digital city map unfurl, a tapestry of green and red dots, his network mobilizing with a speed that defied logic. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the cold clench of his jaw. He had allowed this. Allowed her to walk into a trap, blinded by her stubborn, infuriating independence and his own misjudgment of Thorne's desperate malice. The guilt was a corrosive acid, burning away his restraint. Thorne's last known location, sir, a sharp, efficient voice cut through the chaos. North Tower. His private, unlisted construction site office. 27th floor. His unfinished tower. The irony was a bitter taste in Dante's mouth. Thorne was making a statement. A final desperate stand, fueled by a vengeance that mirrored Dante's own dark history. But Thorne was a fool. He had touched the one thing Dante was beginning to truly value, truly claim. Mobilized two teams, Dante snapped, already striding towards the door, his movements fluid, deadly. One to secure the base. The other, with me. No collateral. But Thorne's men, disable them. Permanently, if necessary, the veiled command hung in the air, cold and unambiguous. There would be no mercy. The black armored sedan, a ghost on the city streets, sliced through traffic, its engine a barely audible hum. Inside, Dante was a coiled spring, his focus absolute. He wasn't thinking of profit or power or reputation. He was thinking of Alara, her scent of old paper and rain, the stubborn defiance in her eyes, the unexpected, fragile beauty of her passion, and the terrifying image of her, alone, vulnerable, in Thorne's clutches. The thought fueled a cold, white-hot fury that threatened to consume him. We have visual on Thorne's personal security detail at the North Tower entrance, sir. A voice reported from the passenger seat. Standard three-man rotation. They look edgy. They will be, Dante replied, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He pulled out a sleek, silenced pistol, checking the magazine with practiced ease. Breach on my command. The sedan screeched to a halt in a darkened alley adjacent to Thorne's tower. Dante and his team moved like shadows, their movements economical, lethal. The entrance was breached in seconds, Thorne's edgy guards dispatched with brutal, efficient blows, their bodies collapsing silently into the shadows. No alarms. No fuss. This was Dante's world. This was how he operated when pushed past the brink. Inside, the unfinished tower was a labyrinth of echoing concrete and exposed steel. The air was thick with the scent of dust and fear. Dante's men moved ahead, sweeping each floor, their comms crackling with rapid updates. Dante himself moved with a terrifying grace, his eyes scanning every shadow, every potential threat. He was a hunter, and Alara was his prey, stolen by a desperate fool. 27th floor clear, sir, except for one central room, a voice whispered in his ear. Heavy resistance. Thorne is there. Dante didn't wait. He burst through the flimsy door, his pistol raised. The scene was precisely as his darkest fears had painted it. Alara, bound to a chair, a crude gag across her mouth, her eyes wide with terror, tears streaming down her pale face. Thorne stood over her, his hand grasping a glinting knife, his face contorted into a mask of manic triumph. Two of Thorne's hulking thugs were already drawing their weapons, startled by Dante's sudden, violent entrance. Time seemed to slow, stretching into an agonizing tableau. Alara's eyes, filled with both terror and a nascent, incredulous hope, locked onto Dante's. In that instant, all his carefully cultivated control shattered. A roar, guttural and primal, tore from his throat. It wasn't human. It was the sound of a predator whose most prized possession had been threatened, whose deepest, darkest instincts had been unleashed. Get away from her. Dante's voice was a low snarl, thick with menace, vibrating with an intensity that made the air crackle. His pistol, a cold extension of his rage, locked onto Thorne. Thorne, startled but defiant, tightened his grip on the knife. Valerius, you actually came for this, Archivist? Fool. This is generations of debt. Dante didn't wait for him to finish. He fired, not at Thorne, but at the hand holding the knife. A clean, precise shot. Thorne screamed, a high-pitched, almost feminine sound, as the knife clattered to the concrete floor, his hand gushing blood. The two thugs lunged. Dante moved with a blurring speed that defied his tailored suit. The first thug, a brutish man with a shaved head, met a swift, devastating kick to the knee, his legs snapping with a sickening crack. He crumpled, a strangled cry dying in his throat. The second, larger man, wielding a heavy metal pipe, swung wildly. Dante dodged fluid as smoke, and the pistol but connected with the man's temple with a sickening thud. He dropped like a stone, unconscious before he hit the ground. All of it happened in less than 5 seconds. A whirlwind of controlled violence, a brutal ballet of efficiency. Dante wasn't just fighting. He was a force of nature, driven by an almost psychotic need to reclaim what was his. His eyes, still blazing with a terrifying intensity, returned to Thorne, who was whimpering, clutching his bleeding hand, his face pale with shock and fear. Dante didn't bother with words. He kicked Thorne's good leg, sending him sprawling to the ground, then pressed the barrel of his pistol against Thorne's temple, the cold metal a stark contrast to the burning fury in his eyes. But his gaze immediately flickered to Alara. She was still bound, wide-eyed, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but alive. Relief, profound and almost debilitating, washed over him, momentarily dimming the incandescent rage. He holstered his weapon and moved swiftly, his powerful hands untying the rough ropes with practiced efficiency, his fingers brushing her skin. The gag came off, and she gasped, drawing in a shaky breath, her eyes still locked on his. Alara, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion he rarely displayed. He reached out, his thumb gently wiping away a tear from her cheek. Are you hurt? The question was quiet, but beneath it, the promise of violent retribution for any harm was clear. She shook her head, unable to speak, her gaze fixed on him, a mixture of terror, awe, and a fragile, undeniable trust blooming in her eyes. The sheer raw power he had unleashed, the speed and brutality of his rescue, was overwhelming. He had appeared like a vengeful god, a dark knight, tearing through the shadows to reclaim her. Dante's eyes, still radiating a dangerous possessiveness, swept over the chaos he had wrought, the broken men, the trembling Thorne. Then he looked back at Alara, his thumb still tracing the curve of her jaw. You're mine, Alara, he stated, his voice a low, possessive rasp that held no room for argument. And no one touches what is mine. The words were a promise, a claim, and a chilling warning to anyone who dared to challenge him. The architect of ruin lay broken at his feet, but the true architect of her fate, she realized, stood before her, his dangerous obsession now undeniably, terrifyingly unleashed. He lifted her into his arms, her body light and trembling, and strode out of the office, leaving Thorne to face the dark, uncompromising justice of Dante Valerius's world. The world outside the pristine window of Dante's private estate was a blur of emerald green and impossibly blue sky, a stark, almost obscene contrast to the grim concrete labyrinth where Alara had nearly met her end. She lay in a bed softer than any cloud she could imagine, the crisp, cool sheets, a balm against her trembling skin. Yet, The physical comfort did little to soothe the raw, gnawing terror that still clawed at her insides. Every shadow held Thorne's sneering face. Every creak of the floorboards echoed his venomous whispers. She tasted ash and fear, the bitter remnants of her abduction, even as the faint, comforting scent of expensive sandalwood and Dante's unique musk permeated the luxurious room. He had carried her out of that unfinished tower, a silent, formidable force, his arms a vice of protection she hadn't known she craved. He hadn't spoken a single word until they were safely within the impenetrable walls of his estate, nestled high in the hills overlooking the sprawling city. Then his voice, rough with an emotion she still couldn't quite decipher, had simply ordered, "Rest. Heal." He was there always. A silent sentinel. He didn't hover, but his presence was a constant, solid anchor in her fractured reality. Sometimes she would stir from a fitful sleep, her heart hammering, to find him sitting in an armchair by the window, his dark eyes fixed on the distant city, a silhouette of quiet power. He brought her small, exquisite meals she couldn't taste, insisted on warm, calming herbal teas, and with a startling gentleness, changed the dressings on the rope burns that still chafed her wrists. His touch was firm, yet incredibly tender, a paradox she was slowly, hesitantly, coming to understand. "You're safe here, Alara," he said one afternoon, his voice low, pulling her back from the precipice of her racing thoughts. He was watching her, his gaze intense, assessing. "Thorne cannot reach you." She swallowed, her throat dry. He was so sure you wouldn't come. He said you'd abandon me." The words were a fragile confession, testing the waters, needing reassurance. Dante's jaw tightened, a muscle clenching beneath his skin. "Thorne is a fool. And a dead man walking." The pronouncement was delivered with such cold, absolute certainty that a shiver, both of dread and a chilling satisfaction, traced its way down her spine. There was no rage in his voice, only an implacable, chilling finality. It was a promise, not a threat. Over the next few days, as Alara slowly regained her strength, the news began to trickle in, painting a vivid, terrifying picture of Dante's reckoning. She saw it on the hushed, carefully chosen news channels he allowed in her room. Thorne Development Group, already reeling from Dante's earlier intervention, was now facing a barrage of fresh lawsuits, criminal investigations, and an unprecedented level of scrutiny. His assets were frozen, not by a single audit, but by a coordinated assault from every conceivable regulatory body. Contractors, once loyal, were abandoning him en masse. Banks were recalling loans. The financial reports spoke of a total, systematic annihilation. "He's being bled dry," Dante explained succinctly one evening, handing her a tablet displaying the latest market crash data for Thorne's plummeting stock. "Every illegal dealing, every shady partnership, every corner cut, it's all coming to light. Not through my direct hand, but through information strategically released to the right channels. The law, Alara, can be a potent weapon when wielded by those who truly understand its weaknesses." Alara stared at the screen, a profound sense of vindication washing over her. Thorne, the man who had threatened to burn her archive, to extinguish Mr. Henderson's last hope, to take her life, he was falling. Completely, irrevocably. A chilling satisfaction, dark and visceral, curled in her gut. She had watched him rise, seen his arrogance, and now she was witnessing his utter destruction. It felt like justice, a primitive, satisfying balance restored. Yet a prickle of unease lingered. This wasn't justice meted out by a jury or a judge. This was Dante's justice. Absolute, uncompromising, and brutally efficient. There was no mercy, no second chances. It was a cold, calculated dismantling of a man's entire existence, orchestrated from the shadows by the formidable figure who now sat across from her. "What about the debt?" she asked, her voice quiet, the words tasting of the moral ambiguity that now permeated her thoughts. "The one with Mr. Henderson." Dante's eyes, dark and unreadable, met hers. "Henderson's family betrayed mine decades ago, during a critical business deal. Cost my grandfather millions. My father considered it a foundational betrayal. Thorne's father, a junior partner, seized the opportunity to profit, consolidating power. Thorne saw the archive as his rightful inheritance, his way of reclaiming what he believed was stolen from his family. A twisted sense of poetic justice." He paused, a faint, almost regretful sigh escaping him. "It does not excuse his actions against you, and it does not absolve him of his own sins." Alara's mind reeled. The layers of betrayal, the ancient grudges, the interwoven histories, It was a tapestry far more complex and dangerous than she could have imagined. Her archive, her life, had been caught in the crossfire of a generational vendetta. And Dante, the Dark Knight who had intervened, was now untangling it all, not with gentle hands, but with an uncompromising ruthlessness that left scorched earth in its wake. As the days turned, Thorne's public disgrace deepened. She saw a grainy photo of him being led away in handcuffs, his face pale and shattered, his once sharp suits rumpled and stained. He looked defeated, utterly annihilated. The image, while providing a profound, almost primal satisfaction, also brought a sobering realization. This was the consequence of crossing Dante Valerius. This was the cost of tangling with the unseen empire he commanded. Her fear of him, once a sharp, ever-present edge, began to soften, morphing into something more akin to a deep, unsettling acceptance. He was dangerous, yes, a force that operated outside the bounds of conventional morality. But he was her danger. His darkness, once terrifying, now felt like a potent shield. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, her most desperate, and he had come. He had waged a silent, brutal war for her. He had protected her, reclaimed her, and in doing so had claimed a piece of her soul in return. One evening, as the city lights began to twinkle in the distance, a dazzling constellation against the dark sky, Dante stood by her window. He didn't turn to her, but his voice, unusually soft, carried through the quiet room. The Viridian Archive. It is secure. Your Mr. Henderson is stable and will make a full recovery. Thorne development is no longer a threat. Alara pushed herself up, drawing the soft blanket around her, and walked to stand beside him, gazing at the glittering panorama. She reached out hesitantly and placed her hand on his forearm, feeling the solid warmth of his skin beneath the expensive fabric of his jacket. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He simply covered her hand with his own, his large, powerful fingers gently, possessively, lacing with hers. "Thank you, Dante," she whispered, the words imbued with a gratitude so profound it felt like a vow. "For everything." He finally turned, his dark eyes meeting hers, and in their depths, she saw not just possessiveness, but a flicker of something deeper, something akin to a quiet triumph. "You are mine, Alara," he reiterated, his voice a low, possessive murmur that settled deep into her bones. "And my possessions are always protected." He drew her closer, his gaze sweeping over her face, absorbing every detail. "The archive, your legacy, your life, they belong to me, and I will never let them crumble again." His words were a dark, potent promise, and as he gently tilted her chin up, her breath hitched, accepting the unspoken terms of this dangerous, undeniable reclamation. His unspoken truth was her new reality. The Viridian Archive no longer smelled of mildew and despair. It hummed with the quiet dignity of polished oak, the crisp scent of newly bound books, and the faint, vibrant aroma of fresh flowers. Alara, now meticulously arranged at the grand entrance. Dante's patronage had transformed it, not into a sterile monument, but a living, breathing testament to history, infused with cutting-edge technology and bathed in a warm, welcoming light. Sunlight, no longer struggling through grime-coated panes, streamed through meticulously restored stained-glass windows, illuminating the intricate details of ancient texts and the busy, hopeful faces of new scholars. Alara walked through the main hall, her steps confident, purposeful. She was no longer just the junior archivist fighting a losing battle. She was the director, her name Alara Vance, now proudly displayed on a discreet brass plaque beside the main doors. A strange, heady mix of profound gratitude and fierce ownership surged through her. This was her kingdom, magnificent and thriving, and she had fought tooth and nail for it. Yet she knew with an unshakable certainty that its rebirth and her own newfound peace were intrinsically linked to the dark, powerful man who stood in the shadows of its new existence. Dante often observed her from a distance, a silent, imposing figure. Sometimes he would be in a newly constructed, soundproofed office overlooking the main reading room, his dark eyes, sharp as ever, missing nothing. Other times, he would simply appear, leaning against a newly polished bookshelf, a rare smile gracing his lips as he watched her interact with a delighted Mr. Henderson, now fully recovered and reveling in the archive's revival. Mr. Henderson, frail no longer, moved with a renewed vigor, cataloging with joyful dedication, his eyes shining with a deep, quiet gratitude towards Alara, and by extension, towards Dante. Their relationship had solidified into a complex, potent bond, unlike anything Alara had ever imagined. It wasn't conventional by any stretch. His possessiveness, once terrifying, had become a bedrock of her security. She had embraced it, understood it as the deep-seated need of a man who had experienced profound loss and now guarded what was his with an unwavering, uncompromising ferocity. She was his. The thought, once a source of internal conflict, now settled in her soul with a comforting weight. One blustery autumn afternoon, Alara was meticulously arranging a new exhibition of rare botanical prints. She heard the subtle shift in the air, the faint scent of expensive cologne, signaling his approach before she saw him. The Anacampsero's rufescens, Dante murmured, standing beside her, his voice a low, rich vibration that sent a familiar shiver down her spine. He pointed to a delicate, almost ethereal plant on a centuries-old print. A succulent. Resilient, yet requires specific conditions to truly flourish. Much like certain legacies. Or certain people. Alara looked up, meeting his gaze. A faint smile touched her lips. And you, Mr. Valerius, provide those conditions. His hand reached out, his long fingers gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was both tender and claiming, a subtle brush that spoke volumes. Always, Alara. Always. His eyes, dark and fathomless, held hers. In their depths, she saw his pride in her, his quiet contentment in the world she had built, and the fierce, undeniable gleam of his possessive love. It was a love that demanded ownership, but also nurtured growth. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His skin was warm, strong, a stark contrast to the delicate paper she usually handled. And I, in turn, she whispered, her voice husky, protect what is ours. Our legacy. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her knuckles. My legacy was forged in darkness. You, Alara, are its soul, its light. Later that evening, they stood together on the sprawling terrace of his estate, the city lights a glittering tapestry below. The air was cool, crisp, carrying the distant murmur of urban life. He had a glass of rare scotch in his hand, she a cup of chamomile tea. The blend of their worlds was complete, a harmonious, if unexpected, symphony. Mr. Henderson is organizing a new outreach program next quarter, Alara said, leaning into his solid warmth, her head resting against his shoulder. Bringing history to local schools. He's so invigorated. Good, Dante murmured, his arm tightening around her. He deserves his peace. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the city. Thorne's assets are fully liquidated. His family name a gone. He is serving a life sentence. Alara felt a flicker of the old satisfaction, but was muted, softened by the secure peace she now inhabited. Justice, she said, almost to herself. My justice, he corrected softly, his lips brushing her hair. Not the city's, but effective. Their life together was a unique blend of quiet intellect and powerful, unspoken protection. He continued to navigate his complex, shadowed world, but he always returned to her, to the light she brought into his life, to the sanctuary she had created. The archive thrived, a beacon of knowledge, a testament to what could be saved, what could be reclaimed, even from the brink of ruin. As the night deepened, a subtle shift occurred. Alara's phone, resting on a small marble table beside her, vibrated once. A notification. Not a text, but a small, anonymous package delivery alert. The timestamp indicated it had been left at the archive's newly secured entrance moments ago. Dante's eyes, ever vigilant, caught the flicker of the screen. He reached for the phone, his fingers brushing hers. His gaze sharpened as he saw the notification. He stood, his posture instantly radiating a silent, dangerous alertness. A gift, he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, but with an underlying steel that spoke of immediate, unwavering readiness. Alara felt a familiar prickle of apprehension, but was no longer the all-consuming terror of before. She met his gaze, a quiet strength in her own eyes. Another challenge, then. Dante's lips curved into a faint, possessive smile. Perhaps. But this time, they come to our doorstep. He placed the phone back on the table, then extended his hand to her. Shall we see what new legacy awaits? Alara took his hand, her fingers firm around his, a silent promise. She was no longer just the archivist. She was the soul of his reclaimed legacy, and together, they would face whatever shadows the world chose to cast upon their newfound peace. She knew the darkness would always lurk, but now she had her dark night and an unshakable, possessive love that would endure any storm. Their shared future was a tapestry woven with threads of danger, devotion, and undeniable, enduring ownership. Isn't it true that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found in dusty vaults, but within the fierce spirit of a soul fighting to protect what truly matters. Alara's journey reminds us your intrinsic worth is never diminished, even when the world tries to deem your efforts futile. Dante's possessive love became a conduit for healing, proving deep scars can pave the way for unwavering devotion. Your past wounds don't define your strength or your right to a love that champions your light. If this story resonated, join our community. Hit like, subscribe for more tales of resilience and romance. In the comments, share a word, I am unbreakable, or my worth is undeniable.